Welcome to class number 13. In our last class, we learned about the purpose of money, inflation, and two main players, the federal government and the Federal Reserve, or the Fed. In this class, we're going to continue the discussion by learning what actually causes inflation and what tools the Fed uses to bring inflation down while trying to also keep unemployment low. We'll conclude by showing you how inflation affects the returns on our investments. Here we go. Let's begin with the causes of inflation. As we learned in our last class, the price of something is a function of the supply and demand for it. The government and the Federal Reserve play a role in influencing prices and, in turn, inflation. The two primary levers that the government can pull that will influence prices are tax revenues and spending. Generally speaking, when a government raises taxes, people and businesses will have less money to spend on goods and services. As such, higher taxes lowers the demand for goods and services, which pushes down on prices. We call this deflationary pressure. Lower demand often triggers layoffs. Conversely, when a government lowers taxes, people and businesses will have more money to spend on goods and services, which pushes up on prices. We call this inflationary pressure. While prices may rise, companies tend to hire more people to meet the demand. Additionally, a government can also raise spending. When the government spends more on goods and services for its citizens, the demand for those goods and services rises, which pushes up on prices. Again, we call this inflationary pressure. While prices may rise, companies hire more people to meet the demand. On the other hand, when a government lowers spending, the demand for goods and services goes down, which pushes down on prices. Again, we call this deflationary pressure. Lower demand can lead to layoffs. When a government spends more than it earns in tax revenues in any given year, it is said to be running a deficit. The government can cover this deficit by borrowing money. When a government spends less than it earns in tax revenues in any given year, it is said to be running a surplus. As we learned in a previous class, a primary way the government borrows money is by issuing Treasury bonds. The total amount owed by the federal government at any given point in time is called our national debt and represents borrowing to fund deficits over the years as well as interest owed on the debt. A government's policy on tax revenue and spending taken together is called fiscal policy. As you can see, fiscal policy needs to strike the right balance between inflation and employment, which is not easy. Let's call the Fed back to the stage. As I previously mentioned, two of the Fed's primary mandates are to achieve maximum employment and keep inflation low. The Fed targets an inflation rate of 2%. Why 2%? Well, that's anyone's guess, but the Fed claims that that's the right level to balance inflation with employment. While the government primarily uses fiscal policy to keep inflation low and employment high, the Fed uses something called monetary policy to do so. What does monetary policy consist of? First, the Federal Reserve sets benchmark interest rates in the economy. The primary interest rate is called the Fed funds rate. This is the rate that the media pays most attention to because it plays a key role in determining the rest of the interest rates in the economy. If the Fed notices inflation in the economy, it can raise the Fed funds rate to make borrowing more costly and to try to cool off demand for goods and services. On the other hand, if the economy is struggling, like during the COVID shutdown or during the financial crisis of 2008-2009, the Fed can lower the Fed funds rate to encourage borrowing and stimulate demand in the economy. When the Fed raises rates, it's considered to be a restrictive or contractionary policy. And when the Fed lowers rates, it's considered to be an accommodative or expansionary policy. It's important to note that when the Fed takes a restrictive stance, its goal is to lower inflation. But at the same time, this policy can have a negative effect on employment. That is, lower demand often leads businesses to lay off workers and unemployment could go up. This restrictive stance is sometimes called a hawkish stance by the Fed. This is a tight balance that the Fed has to strike. When you hear the term soft landing, this is what they are referring to. On the other hand, when the Fed takes an accommodative stance, its goal is to stimulate demand and employment. But at the same time, this policy can have the negative effect of inflation. That is, higher demand often leads to higher prices and inflation rising. This accommodative stance is sometimes called a dovish stance by the Fed. The second tool at the Fed's disposal is called open market operations. Open market what? This is a fancy term that just means that the Fed will actually buy short-term Treasury investments from or sell short-term Treasury investments to investors to manage how much money is in the financial system. The primary investments the Fed will buy or sell are called short-term U.S. Treasury bills. Remember the ones we discussed in class number 11? We're talking about those. When the Fed buys investments, it's putting more cash into the financial system, which the Fed hopes will help increase economic activity and employ more people. But putting too much cash in the financial system can have the offsetting effect of creating more inflation. This is another accommodative or expansionary policy. On the other hand, if the Fed sells investments, it's effectively pulling more cash out of the financial system. This is a tactic to reduce inflation, but it may cause unemployment to rise. This is another restrictive or contractionary policy. In times of great financial distress, like during the COVID-19 pandemic and the subprime mortgage crisis, we'll discuss these later, the Federal Reserve resorted to a more drastic measure to ensure the economy didn't collapse into a depression. This measure is called quantitative easing, or QE, which is a fancy term that just means the Fed purchased long-term Treasury bonds and other types of bonds that we'll discuss later, such as mortgage bonds. This injected a much higher amount of money into the economy than open market operations does. The Fed, like any other person, company, or government, has its own balance sheet. By purchasing investments, the Fed's balance sheet grows. The opposite of quantitative easing is called quantitative tightening, or QT. This is a restrictive stance to try to curb inflation once QE is no longer needed. The Fed has other tools it may use to meet its responsibilities, but these are the main ones I want you to know about. Okay, Rob, you're telling me that the Fed controls the supply of money in the economy, but I thought that the U.S. Mint does that. U.S. coins are produced by the U.S. Mint, and U.S. currency is produced by the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing, of which operates under the U.S. Department of Treasury, which is under the executive branch of the government. The Fed is the one who places orders for coins and currency to control the supply of money in the economy. As you can see, the Fed and the U.S. government are incredibly powerful institutions, and understanding how they work is a key to understanding inflation. There are other factors that can cause inflation by affecting the supply and demand of goods and services. For instance, if a government decides to increase a sales tax, then goods and services will likely become more expensive. Additionally, a government can charge a tariff or a special type of tax for imports, which will also likely push up inflation. Other factors such as consumer confidence, wars, natural disasters, and psychology can push prices higher. In our last section, we're going to discuss how inflation impacts our investment returns. Let's use an example. Let's assume you buy a 1-year U.S. Treasury bill paying 5% fixed interest. In 1 year from now, you'll earn 5% interest excluding income taxes. It's important to note that this pre-tax return does not factor in the impact of inflation. For instance, if inflation was 3% during the same year, the money invested really only grew by 2% after inflation. In this example, the pre-inflation return is 5% and the post-inflation return is 2%, excluding taxes. The pre-inflation return is referred to as the nominal return, and the post-inflation return is referred to as the real return. When you hear nominal, think excluding the effect of inflation, and when you hear real, think including the effect of inflation. Investment decisions should always consider and factor in the effect of inflation or an estimate of inflation. This will give you an apples-to-apples comparison when making decisions. As you've seen, inflation can hinder our wealth building and our investing goals. It's incredibly important to understand how inflation works, as we'll see when we continue our lessons on investing. In our next class, we'll discuss 2 more important concepts before we begin our deep dive on investing. We'll go into greater detail on supply and demand, and we'll also discuss the legal forms of different businesses. This info will help us out greatly as we continue on our journey. If you have any questions at all, I encourage you to contact me at opusmonetequestions@gmail.com or comment below, and I will try my best to get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks for watching. If you found this content to be helpful, I'd like to invite you to hit the subscribe button and give us a like. You can find additional resources, insights, and motivation by following us on Instagram. Also, we greatly appreciate your recommendations. If you think this content may help your friends and family, share the wealth and let them know about us. See you all in class number 14. Peace!